Aaron, thanks very much for agreeing to chat today. I am curious to just hear about your career journey. And as a young professional and as a filmmaker who does a lot of different types of things, I'm curious to hear like where you got your spark, what the journey to where you are now is like, and like what are you doing now that is maybe different or unique in terms of what it means to be like a working professional in 2024. So yeah, the floor is yours, man. I would love to just kind of hear your origin story. How did you become Batman?
The origin story is really I started out in media very, very young. I basically was in fifth grade when my stepdad uh, got into camcorders. He's always gone through like these kind of nerdy phases in a way. I say that like in a very complimentary sense, but he's always had a hobby. And when I was in fifth grade, my stepdad's hobby at the time was camcorders. Like I don't know if you were of the age when you would have been using like these DV tape
Oh yeah,
uh,
yeah, the mini
little
DV
camera.
tapes.
Yep.
Yeah, and then it takes as long to pull that footage as it did to shoot
Yep.
it. Horrible
Oh yeah.
system.
It was, yeah. I mean, especially like being like 12 years old, you're like, what is this? like, but yeah, I mean, just running around the woods, telling my friends to fight each other, and record it for our little DV tape movies was kind of how I got started. Stealing my stepdad's camera, all that kind of stuff to go make these things, and yeah, I got really into it. I was just that movie kid in middle school. I basically spent the better part of a year in sixth grade, like forcing my friends at the time to hang out with me on the weekends, and we basically I still have it on tape somewhere. It's like this 32-minute long like detective film noir epic about good and evil and this detective hunting down the bad guy, and it's just like it's just 12-year-old boys in the forest like yelling at each other and pretending to be adults, and it's basically how it all started for me. I mean, I was kind of really into film production from a very young age. I was definitely that kind of middle school kid who would go through the AFI top 100 list and like tick off boxes like, oh yes, now I've seen Chinatown, now I've
Okay,
seen.
so you were digging into the classics at a young age.
Yeah, I was a big nerd. So, yeah, still am.
What do you
But
think that did for you though? Like to really I mean, because I think it's interesting, like you, no matter how fringe it might be to watch now, you made a 32-minute film at a very young age. Not a lot of filmmakers can say that. You watched a ton of classics at a fairly young age. Like, how do you think that kind of steeping in it and doing it and experiencing it, early on shaped you?
I reflect on this quite a bit in terms of, there are quite a lot of people I talk to. I work with a lot of students these days. So like my main kind of day job professional role is like mentoring student projects, university grad and undergrad. So I'm always giving career advice. Like half my job is giving, these 20-year-old kids career advice, and a lot of what I hear is don't know what to do, don't know if I have a passion in life. Like, these 20-year-olds are talking to everybody they can get their hands on, asking, how did you do it and where did you go? And they're trying to figure out their lives. And I can kind of be a good and a bad bound like soundboard for them, and bad in the sense that like I'm a guy who's always known what I wanted to do. Like since I was 10 years old, I was like, that's my thing. It makes it easy sometimes to always feel like you've known what you wanted to do. And then it's hard other times too, where it's like, well, if it doesn't work out, like who am I?
Right.
That's the other thing.
Your
So
identity becomes kind of wrapped up in that. So after you got through the AFI Top 100, what was like your next step on your journey?
that would have been ninth grade. I kind of graduated to my high school relationship to film watching and filmmaking. It was kind of a bummer in some ways, in the sense that I think I kind of stepped into ninth grade kind of feeling like, oh, I have to be cooler. I have to get into sports. I
Yeah.
have to, you know, do things to make myself more cool,
Mm,
right? So I would say there were maybe a couple years there where I was really trying on the jock persona. I was on the crew team. I was doing athletics and that kind of
sure.
stuff. I took a brief little break from filmmaking and film really being a huge part of my identity. Um, I did get back into it, especially as like college applications were rolling around, and I knew I wanted to go to film school. Like even though I wasn't quite as like directly engaged with production for like my first couple of years of being a high school student, like it was always in the back of my mind. You know, there's never any question that I wasn't gonna apply to film schools and that kind of stuff. So you know, then I started watching, I guess, more international cinema, and like I got into like the edgy boy cinema. You know, I got into. Do you know like Gaspar Noé and
No,
Harmony
not
Korine?
no, I don't think so.
All right, you should check them out.
Okay.
They're Donnie Darko. You know, I got
Oh,
into
yeah, yeah,
Fight
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Donnie Darko and Fight Club. You know, I got into my like edgy boy cinema phase, and
Late high school is a good time for that.
I don't know what else did I do. I started. I definitely started getting early into documentary
Mm,
um, as I was applying to film schools and that kind of stuff. My application film to get into Emerson College, which is where I got my undergraduate degree, was a documentary of just basically vlogging this camping trip I went on with my friends. Like really, really, you know, nothing of interest, nothing to really report on, just four white dudes going camping, and that was my ticket to film school.
yeah.
Uh, yeah, you know,
Well, that's interesting because documentary, I think, is one of those things that when you're first discovering quote unquote cinema, falling in love
yeah.
with movies or whatnot, I don't hear a lot of people talk about documentaries. You know, it's they're not widely played in the theaters. They're not necessarily, you know, if your goal is to be cooler in high school, you know, coming in and talking about, you know, Grizzly Man. Grizzly Man may be the exception for that. I remember kids talking about that one, but in general, talking about the latest doc you saw isn't the way to go. So was it through practice again, like the doing of it, that you found a love for documentary, or was there like a moment where you watched one that really like was a lightning bolt to the brain?
During my undergraduate career, it was still I really kind of got way more into experimental film, and I was like, oh, I want my films to be in museums, not theaters, and I got very into like art world cinema, and that overlaps very heavily with documentary because like a lot of avant-garde stuff is kind of blurring that line between what the audience understands to be real or staged, and I ended up really kind of loving that, and that it sounds like I'm describing a film that is like in some way kind of tricking the audience or like playing with the audience's expectations in a uh, disingenuous way. But I think people go into these movies kind of understanding this is gonna be a film that is going to blur this boundary
Yeah,
between what I'm supposed to, as the audience member, perceive as real or fake, and that's like
right.
the point of the movie.
That concept of what's real and what's not is woven throughout all of cinema, whether it's a stunt that's, you know, in even in a narrative film, like there are stunts that are done that are meant to obviously look real, very fake. I think about a movie like Bernie or even Interstellar, which I just
Mhm.
rewatched
Yeah.
recently, where real interviews are being cut in amongst fake interviews. And, you know, like in Interstellar, they used actual interviews with survivors of the Dust Bowl, um, and put them in this sci-fi film. And there is this sense of experimental documentary more so, but there is a sense, I think, whenever you step into the theater, of you're kind of trusting the filmmaker that, like, hey, by the end of this movie, it will all make sense. By the end of this movie, you will have earned the right to trick me or whatever it is.
Yeah, 100%. Or even just like you've earned the right to leave it ambiguous, but in a way where I feel confident that you knew what was happening, and there's an intelligent construction behind the ambiguity, even if I, as the audience member, still feel like I'm figuring it out years later or something like that.
Right.
You
Right.
know, but I don't think anybody wants to go to the movie theater and be like, oh, this person pulled the wool over my eyes and just, you know,
I've watched
jerked me
films
around.
that feel like that. I've watched, and there's some of my least favorite movies in that,
Yeah.
like, you know, oh, this film acted really smart, but like upon rewatching and whatnot, like they never gave me a chance. They just pulled a magic trick, but didn't give us any sort of way to understand the how, why. There's one in mind that's coming, but I'm not going to trash it,
Oh, come
publicly.
on. Yeah. Okay. Okay.
The Illusionist from
Uh,
with Edward Norton. That it's
yeah.
a really fun film, but you get to the end and they do the big flashback of all the, oh, this was what was really going on, and I'm like, there were no tangible clues that I could
Right.
grab onto all the way throughout to feel like, oh, now I get it. By contrast, The
Right.
Prestige, which came out at the same time, ironically, there are
Yep.
plenty of little clues that as they reveal things, you go, that's what that was. And so that's, to
Yeah.
me, those are
Yeah.
like such a great example of like two magic films, one done in a way that, like, as an audience member, I come out feeling smarter, and the other where I come out feeling dumber. And it's,
Right.
yeah,
Right. Yeah, I mean, I love those movies where it's like the last you put the last puzzle piece in, and
yeah,
only then can you decipher the whole picture. Like those, yeah, it's super fun.
yeah. So you went to film school, and what was that experience like, and how did that lead into maybe like your first career steps?
Yeah, so Emerson College is a small kind of communications liberal arts school up in Boston, and I really cannot complain too much about my time at Emerson. I definitely have some school spirit from my days up there. I will rep Emerson pretty hard. They taught us on celluloid stills, so like my first like proper film class was with a Bolex on 16
I
millimeter,
also shot
and then
16 mil. Great experience
oh
to do.
yeah,
Yeah. Yep.
I feel it's such an underrated way to like learn how to tell stories.
Yeah.
Like just the whole process of every second you have your hand on that record button is worth its time in money, like worth its weight in gold. I don't know.
Yes.
You are film is expensive,
It
right?
very,
And so if you're
yes.
making like a cost analysis of shooting on celluloid, then you're really like, if I'm gonna press this record button, I need to make sure that every square inch of my frame is how I want it because I'm just wasting money if it's not. And I loved learning like that. And yeah, then we did Super 16 for our like year two film. That was really fun. Um, and yeah, Emerson was great. I just kind of like hung out with a bunch of cinephile nerd friends, and they were all chain smokers, and we stayed up till 3 in the morning, like every night watching weird movies. And uh, yeah, I mean, it was really kind of like uh, a wonderful experience, and definitely, if I wasn't already kind of like leaning towards experimental film, by the time I got out of Emerson, like I was like, oh, I want to do weird stuff, and
Yeah.
I want to pursue idiosyncratic
Hmm.
stories, and I want to kind of dive into oppositional storytelling in some way. One of the big ideas like came out of Emerson with was this idea of like oppositional versus dominant cinema,
Hmm.
and I want to tell stories that would challenge the status quo, not contribute to it.
Interesting.
Um, and that's kind of carried over quite a bit for me. But
Can you expound on
um,
that just a little bit more for me, and like what the
yeah,
theory behind that is?
yeah. So it's I mean it's kind of like the all language is politics idea. Like if you're gonna say anything, you are either uh, contributing to the dominant way things are done, or you are going against the grain. Uh, what's the word? Undermining it in some way. And so I mean, the easiest kind of most straightforward example I can think of is you could either make a film in the style and aesthetics, format, and subject matter of something like um, the Avengers, for lack of a better example, or you can make a film that is trying to say, there are other priorities to this project than spectacle or exhibition or something like that. And if you extrapolate that out, it's you can look at that as in who are stories for and what are stories intended to accomplish by being told. And I think I've always kind of identified with misfits in a way, or people who are trying to have their voices heard, who are maybe like on the kind of outside of society in some way. And so for me, like style always has to kind of match content to some extent. And so like the style of my filmmaking, I was like, I need to match this to the, if I'm going to tell stories about people trying to have their voices heard, I kind of want my style to match that content in a sense. And so yeah, it all kind of coalesced during my undergrad in terms of like what kinds of stories I was going to be interested in telling, and really kind of like the format as well, trying to pursue some weirder, some more atypical framing, some
Yeah.
more atypical structures, that kind of stuff.
Yeah. And I think in film, that's super interesting because we've seen the way that over commercialization of certain things has and oversimplifying of things a la, a Marvel movie or whatnot has contributed to kind of everything starting to look homogenous, right? And what was once maybe a little fresh and a little new, once it's done too many times, it becomes the new norm. And so, how do we challenge that, right? So, do you
Totally.
ever feel like there's just this sense of like a cycle in that? Because the atypical framing becomes typical eventually, and then you have to change it up again.
There, 100%. I mean, I think the big example from my undergrad years was really, so I was in college from 2013 to 2016. And so that was really the era of like Chivo and
Mm,
Emmanuel Lubezki doing The Revenants,
yep.
doing all those films. And for me, I really honed in on the use of like the long take
Yeah.
in his films. And I remember like not even for school at the time, just writing like a personal essay on how Lubezki's use of the long take was this example of taking something kind of experimental, and idiosyncratic, and avant-garde and weird, and turning it into more of like a mainstream spectacle, right? And and it happens almost without fail. Somebody will take something from the outside and make it marketable and consumable to mass audiences. um I think it makes it exciting.
Mm,
Like once those super long takes become popularized, they enjoy a few years of like every movie's got to have one. James
right.
Bond's going to have one. Avengers going to have one.
Yeah.
Every movie's going to have this spectacular long take. But then what that does is it forces those on the outside to be like, oh, well, that's not ours anymore. Now we have
Yeah.
to go do something else that's new and transgressive.
Or or just reinterpreting what the long take is. There's a scene from the movie A Ghost Story where it's like a 4-minute shot, but it's a locked off. The character barely moves in the frame. It's this woman who's grieving her dead husband, and we watch her eat an entire pie. Like she just what starts as like, oh, good, she's finally eating. She hasn't eaten in days, turns into this. She's grieving and she's gorging herself, and then she ends up vomiting, and it's just this very like uncomfortable, hard to watch long take. And so it's like
Yeah,
on paper you could say, well, that's a oneer, just like something from James Bond is a oneer, but completely different usage, completely different tone, um,
totally.
and still just as fresh of a way of doing something.
Exactly. Like I said, people will always find a way to make something new, or maybe like maybe quick cutting becomes the next thing. There will always be something new. I mean, I do get kind of doomer about uh, filmmaking broadly. I like just the news recently. Nothing's making money anymore. The exhibition industry is dead. Like we'll see what happens next. No matter what happens with exhibition, I mean, there will always be like transgression happening in visual media. So that's what makes me excited about stuff.
100%.
Yeah.
So you kind of commit yourself to idiosyncratic, kind of avant-garde filmmaking, trying new things, challenging the status quo. What does it look like for Aaron after college? What's the next step for you, and where did your career start to shape?
This is where it gets kind of like exciting for me to talk about, because I do feel like I have a really odd story after film school, because lots of people go to film school. There are, tons of people go to film school and they have big ideas about being the next Quentin Tarantino or being the next whoever, right? And they're like, film school is an integral part of my process in ascending to that level of production. And then everybody graduates film school at some point, and realizes that it's not that easy. And unless you have amazing connections and a lot of luck and a lot of money, like, you know, there, number one, there cannot be another Quentin Tarantino. There already is one, and you also just have to find your own way, right? So I the last semester of my undergraduate career that I did was a study abroad program, not abroad, but a study away program in LA. Emerson has a campus in LA. I was there for 3.5 months, and I did an internship with an indie production studio, which was basically a script development internship, um, at the studio at this like particular studio that had made some films that I really loved.
Mm,
And I absolutely hated that experience more than I
interesting.
can ever possibly put into words. I was just completely heartbroken by that experience of living in LA, not even particular, like just in terms of like a living situation. Like LA as an urban environment didn't
Yeah.
connect with me. There's tons of traffic. It's very hot. It's not a particularly pretty city in my mind. And then just getting a more of an inside look at the uh, production industry,
Yeah.
I was I was just not. I did not feel like it was the place for me at all.
How the sau you
And
seen how the sausage gets made can be tough sometimes. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, and this was a script development internship, so I was not on set during this time. I was in an office building, but working with some people in the industry who've made films that I know you've heard of,
Yeah.
and um, and I just felt like it was very like exploitative,
Mm.
and 90% of what I was doing was buying my boss's kids birthday presents, sending back clothes that he didn't want, planning out his vacations, basically like doing his laundry, getting his
Yeah.
lunch, all that stuff.
Not what you dreamt
Uh,
of when you thought, "I'm gonna be an avant-garde filmmaker."
Yeah, and not what I dreamt of when I was running around the woods with my little DV
Yeah.
cam,
Yeah.
so it was kind of tough,
Yeah.
and so I left LA, swore to never go back, that kind of thing, and I did an AmeriCorps program. So I did nothing compared to nothing in the film industry for a
Not
little
not
bit.
to psychoanalyze you, but that's fascinating to me that you went from kind of this job that you hated, that where you were basically being someone's servant, to serving, right?
Yeah.
And to really throwing yourself into doing something that matters to make the world better. That's an interesting kind of way to react to that in a good way, I think. But yeah.
It has always been important to me to feel like to feel positive about the work I do.
Yeah.
I definitely everybody has their own threshold for this in terms of what's important to them financially in life and what kind of risks that they're willing to take
Yeah.
on or can take on. Like there's a lot of things in my life that I try to be very cognizant about the privilege I have to like take some risks and to say I'm going to go do this AmeriCorps program for a year and make $3 an hour, and I'll be able to eat that for a year because I can ask my parents for help, and because I'm given circumstances in my life, I'm pretty confident that I'll make it someday. That kind of thing. I didn't know exactly how AmeriCorps was going to contribute to a career or anything,
Sure.
and maybe in the long run anyway. But I knew that I wanted to do work that I felt good about.
Mm,
Um, and so I worked at a high school in North Philadelphia for a year. I did start a film club, an after school film club. So
nice.
I did, I wasn't giving
Gotta
up
keep it
during that
going.
time.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And after that, I was like, this is something that I'm enjoying. And I was probably 23 at the time, so I was like, I'm still young. I can still take some of these risks. And so from that AmeriCorps program, I then went and taught English in Indonesia for a year. And so here's where like the story I'm telling is definitely starting to not be your typical filmmaker
Yeah. Yeah.
narrative. Um,
That's fantastic though. I'm on the edge of my seat.
I really, really, really advocate for like creative problem solving in life.
Hmm.
I think if you want to make films and you want to make any kind of art, um, you have to like work for it, and you have to work for it persistently, even when deals and offers are not just
Yeah,
being like magically appearing on your desk,
yeah,
right? And so the move from doing AmeriCorps to teaching English in Indonesia for a year was very, very strategic in my mind. Because once, as I was finishing my AmeriCorps year, I was increasingly certain that I wanted to go to graduate school.
mm,
And I had already applied to a couple at that time. I had applied to the Peace Corps even. I had applied to a few things, all with this in mind that okay, I need to go to grad school because my long term plan at this point was really developing itself to be I want to teach. I
mm,
want to teaching sounds cool. I like working with young people. I like talking about film and talking and like showing people how to make films. And then, hey, teachers get their summers off and they get to go
there you
make
go.
movies and they get sabbaticals
Yep.
and there's freedom in that to make work that I'm interested in. So in going and living in Indonesia for a year sounds like it's really fun, and it was. But from the moment I left the United States, for me, it was very much a resume builder for what I was anticipating were going to be future graduate school
Sure.
applications. And for me, yeah, going to Indonesia was a way to stand out from the crowd and to add something interesting to my resume that I thought would set me apart, that would make it look like I had international experience, that I would add to my educational teaching experience, that kind of stuff. And then I also, while I was there, I continued I really kind of doubled down on producing independent work while I was living in Indonesia. And these were pretty small films. These were kind of smaller experimental films, the first couple, really more like personal experimental work. And then the last film that I made while I was living in Java was a documentary about land management
Mm,
on the outskirts of the city where I was living. So
yeah.
I was living in this city called Bandung. It's like 2 or 3 hours east of Jakarta. It is not really a tourist destination, so most people in the West may not have heard of Bandung, but it's a really large. I think the population is like 3 million. Like it's a pretty dense
Okay.
urban
Yeah.
area, and I just made this film about this tourist attraction that had been built near this farm on the outskirts of the city, and how an influx of tourists was changing, the economics of this little town, and how they would needed to repave this road, and how that was creating all this kind of tension between local leaders and
Sure.
the farm people. And I was, just a little documentary about this tourist attraction, and that ended up being what I guess kind of number one really brought me back hardcore into like I'm a documentarian now,
Interesting. Yeah.
and got me into grad school for it
Yeah.
too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So from grad school, when are have you graduated grad school? Are you still in grad school at this point?
No, I got my I graduated 2 years ago, so
Okay.
I have the MFA at this
Gotcha.
point from the University of North Texas.
Okay.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
so how did that then lead to your current position? And what are you doing now?
Right now, I am the multimedia editor and video producer for an organization called Planet Forward. And we are basically an educational publishing platform for undergraduate and graduate students who are doing environmental journalism, documentary, nonfiction storytelling. So yeah, that's big picture what I kind of do now. Yeah.
It's interesting though because it's a it's tied to education, and you've talked about your desire to teach. It's tied to the environment and to kind of bettering the world, which there are markers in your story of wanting to do things in that direction. um but I know from talking with you, just kind of as we've gotten to know each other over the last few months, that like it's a good job, but there's more you're doing as well. And can you just talk a little bit about, like, you've graduated, you've gone through your quote unquote academic journey, you have an MFA, you have a job. I think a lot of people might look at that and go, "Cool, you made it." And do you feel that way, or do you feel like there's more you're trying to do, that there's more things to be and learn and whatnot for you right now?
I think on some level, everybody is always hungry. I feel like everybody's always hungry for more. And absolutely feel like I have greater ambitions than what I'm currently doing. At the same level, I'm also really trying to like retrain myself to appreciate the here and now more. And it's getting a little bit easier and easier as I do get somewhere comfortable in terms of career and finances and all that kind of stuff. Um, but especially like the story I just laid out, Boston, LA, North Philadelphia, Indonesia, Texas. Now I currently live in Washington, DC, at my current position. This is over the course of my 20s. I'm 29
Yeah.
right
That's a
now. I'm
lot
turning
in a
30 in a couple
decade. That's a
months.
lot in 10, 15 years. Yeah.
And so the idea of like settling down for me at this point is like, what does that even mean? Like I have moved cross country and internationally like every couple of years now for the past decade.
Yeah.
Um, and what does it look like to settle down and kind of grow more comfortable in a more long term career position maybe?
Yeah.
And it's weird. It's not the easiest thing in the world because I'm just like I've always been like, what's next?
Right.
What's next? And all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And to an extent, I mean, I feel like that's a good thing.
Yeah.
I feel like you have to stay hungry. You have to always be
Yeah.
looking for something better,
Well, and
right?
it's funny, I'm not gonna launch into my career story, but there are similarities in the sense, so I'm 35, and my 20s were every couple of years, we're moving, we're changing something, all these different things. And then what I've found, everybody's journey is different, but for me, what I found is that the stints of how where I was at places started to get longer and longer, right? So it was every couple of years for a while, and then it was 3.5 years, and then it was almost 6 years. And now I've started a new job, and I have a plan of being here for at least five, if not more. And so it's interesting. I think the days of, oh, I got my job at the factory and I'm going to stay there for the next 40 years, at least for creatives, I don't see that happening. Um, but I think as you grow, you stretch those muscles, and that wanderlust doesn't go away, but you do find a groove in places, and you find new
Yeah.
ways to kind of reinvent the same job and whatnot. That's what I found. I have no idea if you'll experience the same thing, but it's interesting because I hear similarities to what my story was in my 20s.
I feel like that tracks pretty closely. I mean, when you're really young and you have very little stability, yeah, you can just pack up
Right.
like for a while. I could pack up all my belongings into a few suitcases, and that was, it was very easy to just put everything I owned into a car.
Yeah.
Now I can't put all this stuff into it. Like I'd have to make two trips instead of one,
Right.
right?
Right.
So yeah,
Um,
yeah.
I'm curious if you could look back. So this is a little bit of a cliche question, but there's a flip side to this question as well. I'm curious if you could, if, look back and talk to your younger self, or just another person. And I know you do this. You mentor, young up and coming professionals, but even like a high schooler, like what advice would you give them? What wisdom would you give a high school you, or a high school, person who's interested in film, with where you're at now and the journey you've been on? What would you tell them?
The advice I would have given a couple years ago may have ended here, but I'm going to add on to this a little bit. A lot of it, like I said, comes down to that creative problem solving is that you have to be flexible. Like take a job, even if it doesn't seem like it is that next rung on the ladder. That's okay because the ladder is a false metaphor anyway. Like that's not how life works, right? So I and you don't like it. Just try things out, and you don't know exactly how they're going to advance your career in some way. Like I thought I had it all planned out. I was going through the if I do Indonesia for a year, it'll look good on my resume. I'll get into grad school, and then I'll do whatever. And in some ways that tracked, like that happened. In other ways, like, I had no idea that once I got into grad school, I'd do all this environmental filmmaking,
Right.
and that would be my new thing.
Or that being in
Um,
Indonesia and making the documentary there was more what would propel you than the so you went to Indonesia for this idea of I'm going to use this as a resume item, but it was the documentary that you made there that actually so it's tricky because it's like the decision to go to Indonesia is still the right decision in hindsight. It's just the reason why was different, which is very fascinating.
and I can really kind of hone in on that point is that when I was applying to my graduate program that I ended up going to, that I was a late enrollee.
Mm,
I had sent some email just inquiring about the program, and the program director was like, "Hey, you sound really interesting. Send me your demo reel,
yeah.
and I can get you in for this upcoming fall." I was asking her about the following fall.
Mm,
I was thinking like, let me get back to the US, let me get settled, and I'll start
right.
grad school in a year. But she was like, I'm gonna get you in as soon as you get back if you can show me a really cool demo reel. And I sent her
Yeah.
my documentary, right? So that really was to your point, like it wasn't going to Indonesia, it was making the film I ended up making
Right.
there. So yeah, like just and the broader point to that really is like you don't know how these little things are going to affect your
Yeah.
life. So just do things and be try to get comfortable being really flexible and take
Yeah.
risks.
That's such
Uh,
good wisdom. It's you just don't know when your break is going to happen, and the break is some people call it luck. I like to think of it as I think it was Mark Twain who said it's time plus opportunity. Like it's you just got to be ready for it, and be
yeah.
curious, right? Like be making things. Like I doubt you made that documentary with a ooh, I'm going to make this to help me get into grad school. You just made it cuz you wanted to make it.
And you know what the other thing is, like I made that documentary with a Canon 60D,
Yeah.
which is not a great camera.
Nope.
And I made it with with the same tripod that I had owned since those DV cam
Yes.
days. Like my little rinky dink tiny little tripod on and my Canon 60D and a little onboard mic. And it was not really a film that was going to screen anywhere, because of those technical limitations. There's a ceiling to that,
Sure.
right? But like what just get out of bed, put your clothes on, walk out the front door and make
Yeah.
something no matter what equipment you have
If
at
you're
your disposal.
worried if you're worried about the fact that you don't have an FX3,
Right.
like you shouldn't be making a film. Like you
Right.
really shouldn't. You need to go back and re-look at your priorities. Like a nice camera is nice. Like it obviously can elevate aspects of a movie, but there are so many examples of great films, the films that have gone on to screen theatrically that were made on an iPhone 7. You know what I mean? Or a 5D or something. Like it doesn't have to be the newest greatest camera for sure.
I was going to add on just a little bit into because I feel like my advice is a little go out and do it, take big risks, figure it out, never give up, that kind of stuff. And at the same time, like your initial question, which is what advice do I wish I had gotten?
Mm,
I feel like I was always the person who was like, I'm gonna be flexible and take risks and
yeah,
do these weird things. The advice I wish I had gotten is more along the lines of uh, like be gentle with yourself. Like
mm,
don't like just like it's gonna be okay.
yeah,
Like you're gonna figure it out. That kind of thing. There's there within I work at like a pretty prestigious university right now, and I work at a really interesting nonprofit, and things are good.
yeah,
Um, but like along the way, there were like massive failures.
yeah,
There were like huge like setbacks, and I mean, COVID set everybody
sure,
back.
yeah,
Like, so
yeah,
and so there were plenty of times I was like, what am I doing with my life? This is a train wreck. And I think the whole process of getting to where I am now would have been a lot easier if I was just a little bit more like gentle with myself,
yeah,
patient, and just kind of trusting that things would work out rather than kind of beating myself up when they weren't.
Yeah.
So it's a long process,
It
you
is.
know?
And I remember a mentor telling me when I was probably about maybe 23, and he was in like his late 50s, and I was working with him. And, I was in a place where, married with a newborn, and couldn't barely like, I was going into credit card debt, and I was, we didn't have a stable solution for laundry. Like there were just these crazy life things that I was just like, I'm spiraling here. Like I can't get my arms around this thing that's life now, let alone a career. And I remember just him in his 50s, grown children, just kind of
Yep.
counseling me like, be patient. You're
Yep.
gonna get there. It takes time. Everybody struggles in their 20s. And it's like, I couldn't hear that then. I can hear that now. And I can look back on it and say, he was right. Sometimes the best advice you can give is just take a deep breath. Go get a good night's sleep. Make sure you eat breakfast and just keep doing that. And eventually things figure themselves out.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the flip side of my question is, with where you're at right now in your career, if you could talk to a mentor, someone who is on the other side of their career, maybe someone you look up to, maybe yourself in the future, whatever it is, what type of questions would you ask them? What type of things are you curious about now, and what type of advice? I'm not going to be able to give it, but I'm just curious, like what are you seeking, and what type of things are you hoping to learn, that maybe someone down the road would be able to teach you?
How to get into real estate, maybe. I mean,
Yeah.
I think for creative people, like having other revenue
Mm,
streams keep you afloat between projects, or to give you the freedom to do more like personal or creative work. I think that's really the
yeah.
first thing that comes to mind is, uh, I can kind of see a future where there are other ways that you're making a living, and there's more freedom to take on passion projects,
Yeah.
that kind of stuff. And so, I think that's kind of that more when I'm thinking about a pursuit on a longer timeline, like looking at a whole career rather than just my 20s, it's how do I make uh better films?
Mm,
How do I make longer films? I'm still a short filmmaker. And that's like I mentioned with ambition earlier. I mean, that's still a huge ambition of mine, is to do feature work at some point. Um, but yeah, I mean, like, how do I make longer films? How do I make more interesting films? And maybe at the same time, not necessarily have to rely on that
mm,
to every day.
yeah.
And I mean, Hollywood stars do this too. Like Mark Wahlberg selling sneakers, right?
Yeah.
So it's
Yeah. I think that's something people forget, is that like even with success, even with notoriety, like every athlete out there is trying to sell their sneaker. You got
or they
Wahlburgers,
have
The
some
Rock.
partial ownership in a restaurant or
Yeah, like
something.
like
Yeah,
that's how they like it's been very interesting to me to hear, like I've kind of done some digging and found out like some of the salaries from some movies and whatnot, and it's like it's not as much as you'd think. It's still an
yeah,
ungodly amount of money, but it's not
right.
as like, oh, I had one big movie so I'm set for life. No, it's not. And so taking that and bringing it maybe down to a different level, it's like, yeah, we got to have multiple revenue streams. Like I've got a day job. I'm lucky enough that I get to do my day job in filmmaking, but it's in corporate filmmaking, government filmmaking, right? It's funding my passion projects and my creative
Yeah,
projects. And I think that that's not only okay, like that's like great. Like I have a lot of freedom now to be able to do the things I want to do with no oversight, with no producer telling me it's got to be a certain way. And that's
100%. That's
yeah,
that's like the reason I did not like many of my friends in undergraduate school did. I went to a lot of people who did that same Los Angeles program with me. And this is not a critique of them. Everybody has their own different
sure.
path, but that's why I didn't stay when they did.
Yeah.
I did not see myself getting a lot of fulfillment out of climbing that ladder and PAing on sets and
Yep.
stuff. And I really made kind of a difficult decision for me at the time to say, let me do this education thing and keep doing my little indie work on the side and see
Yeah.
where that takes me. And I mean, I can say now, like, yeah, my day job, similar to yours in some ways, is in the film industry in a way, but not the same way. Ever like when you say I'm in the film industry, people
Right.
picture something else.
Right.
Right? So
But I
yeah,
think also a great insight that like the film industry is broad. The media industry
yeah,
is broad. Like there is a classic Hollywood idea that I think people have, but if you're an up and coming creative, filmmaker type, there's a lot of different ways to do that. There's a lot of different ways to be that. Whether you're going to go be a YouTube content creator, whether you're going to teach, whether you're going to work for a government agency, whether you're going to go to Hollywood and PA and write scripts and things like there's as many different ways to do it as there are films.
yeah. It's a good point. That's a good point. And I think it's even for, like I have friends who do still work. Like one of my really good friends is a studio manager at a commercial house, and he is managing commercial shoots for Dunkin' Donuts and that kind of stuff. And same thing for him, like that is his day job. That is a day job that pays the bills, and he goes home and he works on his personal projects. And he's maybe a little bit more inside like what the stereotypical film industry is than I am. But you know, I think for all of us in this kind of realm, freedom is really like the key motivator sometimes. And that's really what motivates me is like I want to continue telling stories that I feel passionate about, that I'm also kind of leading. Like I just like being the director, and
Yeah.
and I'm also not willing to take the gamble on being a PA for 20 years in the hopes that I'll become a Hollywood director someday.
Right.
I I want to be the director now, and that means in terms of scale and budget and certain things, that's we're talking in a different realm
Right.
than what we people think of in terms of Hollywood industry or the mainstream film industry. But that for me, it's like, well, the people are still going to watch the movie. Like people,
Yeah.
like if I make good enough work and interesting enough work that stands on its own, like different audience, but it's an
Yeah.
audience. And at the end of the day, like that's really the important thing. It's
Right.
like making stuff that I actually feel strongly
Well, and I
about.
think I think the fact that you've gone through a journey where you can define, what you think success looks like for you. And at this moment in time, right? Like in 10 years, success may look very different for you. And that's
Yeah,
great. I know success has changed for me several times
yeah,
over the years. But
yeah.
knowing what it is you want, knowing what it is who you're trying to reach, what your values and your priorities are, like that's key to being kind of a grounded creative because the creative life is hella difficult and it's very
Can I ask you a question?
emotionally taxing. And the last thing that we need as creatives is to have no idea why or what we're doing.
I know we're running out of time, but how have your expectations changed over the years in terms of your career?
Oh
Like, what did
gosh.
you go in wanting to do, and how are you managing those expectations now?
Yeah.
Because I totally agree with what you're saying in terms of I don't I think if a few like thinking about the butterfly effect, like if
Yeah.
there were a few different things that had happened, maybe I would feel much more disappointed and unhappier with where I've ended up. But personally, I'm like pretty. I've actually never felt this like chill. Like I'm
Nice.
like,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
no, okay, like I'm doing
And
stuff.
that's
I'm
success right there.
I'm
Yeah.
quite fine. Like like everything could be better, but I'm quite good.
Yeah.
And that has been a shocker to me in the sense of, well, if I look at the expectations I had in middle school when then people were
Mhm.
like, "Oh, you must want to be the next Steven Spielberg,"
Yeah.
and like, like that's if those are the expectations you're setting out with, how can working in academia or
Right.
government filmmaking, how can that feel like it stacks up? But it's not for me. It's not even like a stacking up thing anymore. It just feels like a totally different
Right.
like understanding and relationship to what success means. So
Yeah.
I'm sorry, that was a really long way to frame a turning it back on you question, but I do want to know, like, what are the expectations changing
I mean,
like?
I think, yeah, it's a similar story in that, like, I went to film school thinking, oh, I'm going to be the person who adapts the Silmarillion. Peter Jackson did the Lord of the Rings. I'll take it the next step, like I had big, big dreams and goals. I wanted to be a Hollywood director. Life hit me across the jaw, and I had to make money for a wife and a young child. And when you need to make money, you don't give a rip where you're making that money. Like, yeah, with your ethics intact. I did real estate, I did weddings, I did really just bad small town corporate videos, but I put food on the table. And then I got a little bit of a bigger job, and then I got a little bit of a bigger job. And where my expectations changed, some of it was out of necessity of just like I can't be picky. I have to change, and I'm still finding ways to enjoy what I'm doing. But where it really changed for me was I had 2 production jobs in a row, like long-term, studio jobs. One of them did a lot of work around helping youth, specifically, houseless youth, and also anti-sex trafficking work. And then the other one worked primarily in public schools and making videos for school districts. And the experience of working in that realm of helping the next generation, of looking out for kids, helping kids discover their passions, helping kids talk about bullying and racism and LGBTQ issues and stuff. Like, it really solidified in my mind, whatever I'm doing, it has to be something that is bettering the world in some way. And on the flip side, I still 100% believe that making a little short film that is silly or scary or whatnot is bettering the world, right? You're telling stories, you're contributing to the grand tradition. For me, it was kind of a rejection of this idea that I had to take the highest paying job, or that, because corporate is where the money is outside of Hollywood. Like, the best money I ever made was on corporate gigs. And, there's nothing wrong with a corporate gig. I'd take one tomorrow if it came across, but it's not what I'm seeking, if that makes sense. It's not what I'm putting out there to manifest for me. Because I don't want my life and my creative journey to be about selling something. I want it to be about helping contribute to the grand tradition of storytelling and to helping people find their voice. Even my day job now, working for local government, it's like, in that role, I get to really help a community. I get to help a
Yeah.
community know about cool events and programs for their kids in the summer, and how our fire department is helping people, and like, we're building a community together, and like, that's meaningful work to me. So that's my very long-winded answer in terms of, like, I think it just boils down to knowing what type of work matters to me and what type of
Yeah.
work doesn't, and being able to, in the same way that you said no to being a PA or a script, editor or whatnot, I eventually had to come to the realization that I have to say no to seeking out just the
Mm.
highest paying thing. Um, Money's great. Money puts food on the table, money pays for student loans. Um, but it you can't sleep on it at night. I guess you could, but like, it's not that comfy. So yeah,
Yeah, yeah, exactly, exactly. And it doesn't, it doesn't fill that hole,
it
It
doesn't.
doesn't.
It doesn't. And
Yeah.
and like, I don't know. It's a hard. It's still a thing I'm struggling with, and still a thing I'm coming to terms with. Kind of this idea that, like, I'm okay not ever becoming wealthy. I'm okay not ever becoming nationally famous. Like, those were big goals for a while for me, and I don't. I think the cool thing is that as I'm letting go of those, it's not a, oh, I failed at them, so I have to give them up. It's a, no, there are better things for me. I'm giving these up because there are better things. And you know what? If in 10 years I do a passionate project that also becomes a commercial success, bring it on. What does Tevye say in the Fiddler on the Roof, when it's talked about how money's the world curse? He's like, may the Lord smite me with that curse and may I never recover. It's like, sure, I'll take it, um, but I'm not seeking it. Yeah.
Hmm. So if it comes eventually, great. But
It comes eventually, great, but as long as I have food on the table and my kids have clothes and the car runs, then what else can I ask for in life?
right.
Just a camera. That's all.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Um, no, that's awesome, and it's definitely something I like heavily identify with. Like, I like I said, I did AmeriCorps, and I
Yeah.
wanted to get into teaching, and I currently work in environmental media, and feeling good about the work you do is like so
It's
essential to
huge.
me.
It's
Um,
huge.
and just like getting to come home from work every day, and like, yeah, I have bad days at work, quite often sometimes. A job is a job is a
Yeah.
job, and it will always feel like work.
Yes.
Um, but I have no moral qualms about what I do.
Yeah.
I get to come home and be like, yeah, I do something pretty cool, and I do something that raises awareness for the environment.
Yeah.
It is helping young people get their careers off the ground. It is teaching them valuable
Mm.
skills. It's also how I've viewed film education entirely. Because when I did grad school, like I said, and I was a teaching fellow for my whole time there, and I would teach like documentary labs,
Yeah.
and then I lectured film production as well. And for me, like teaching young people how to make films, especially at the university where I was working, where it was like these big class sizes, I knew that not all the students were going to go into filmmaking.
Sure.
Like
Yeah. Yeah.
this is all education, really. Like that not all of the students in your class are going to go off and pursue filmmaking,
Yeah.
but it gives back to them in the sense that they are, regardless, honing their communication skills, learning how to be
Yes.
collaborative, learning a new tech, like learning how to integrate a new technology into a project.
Yeah.
That very, very kind of like transferable skill type whatever.
Yes.
They're still gaining a lot from the experience if you build it for them in the right way.
Mm.
I get so much out of that, just being like, yeah, this student's going to go to law school. They're not even going to do film, but they're getting a lot out of
But
this
they're going to
process.
learn some basic storytelling principles that may really help them when they're
Yeah,
practicing law. Like
yeah,
a lot of what I learned in film school around directing, I applied in management roles that I've held, and vice
yep,
versa. Things I've learned in, corporate management, classes I've used as a director. Um, Life is not this siloed thing. Like everything you do can impact another aspect of your life and enrich it if you let it. Well, dude, thanks so much for taking this time to chat and hearing your full. I mean, we had talked before, but hearing your full story is super inspiring. I think what I'm taking away from this, just off the top of my head, is just like, stay flexible, but stay curious. Like be looking for new ways to tell stories. I love the fact that you weren't going to Indonesia to do a documentary, but you did one, and that led to the next big thing. And we met because you have a documentary that you're working on that's kind of set here in where near where I am in Minnesota. Um, you found a gentleman on the internet who is a math professor, or was a math professor, and is a mathematician, um,
math, math teacher,
math
yes, yeah,
teacher. Yep. Okay. And um, he's got an incredible story. And so we hooked up so that we could do some filming together, local crew and all that. But so his name is Taha, and the documentary's name, at least currently, is Taha's Theorem. And I'm just really curious to hear a little bit more about the genesis of this documentary and what you can tell us about. I know it's in post production right now, because I think that there's elements of the story, of at least that I know of you starting this doc, that really are kind of like, the peak of our little mountain we've been building here with this conversation, and all the little life lessons and the way things have come together. So would you just talk a little bit about Taha's theorem?
yeah, yeah. So I came up with this idea like several years ago. Actually, this is a little bit of a late start to making this film, but I was in graduate school in Texas. And this is 2020, height of COVID. Just you know, everything feels like it's bad, right? It's
Yeah.
COVID bad. The This was kind of like the height of the Black Lives Matter summer,
Mhm.
and just everybody was just so unhappy with the police in this
Hmm.
country, and the way that police reform just felt so slow and ineffectual. And this was also like leading up to the presidential election as well,
Yeah.
and that felt bad. And it was just a bad time for everybody, right? And
Yeah.
so I got really in my feels, and got really interested in kind of thinking about like utopian stories,
Mm.
and looking at how other cultures had different ideas of nationhood and how to build a society, and how to kind of pursue egalitarianism in maybe different ways than what we're currently pursuing in the United States. And long story short, I got really interested in how the Kurdish ethnicity in northern Syria was, they have this autonomous region where they've kind of built a kind of little society that functions basically around some tenets of socialism. The other thing about the Kurds that's interesting to a lot of Westerners is that they tend to be kind of have more gender parity in their like social structures than what Westerners often think of Middle Eastern ethnic groups having. So like one of like the key notable features that we see in the West is these images of Kurdish women who are like ISIS fighters, and how there's like there's parity in their militaries and that kind of thing. And I was like, that they just seem really interesting. I would love to make some sort of cultural documentary about Kurdish people. And it was just this idea I had. I didn't know any Kurdish people at the time, but it was just this kind of outlet for me to think about how different ethnicities around the world build a sense of nationhood and parity and egalitarianism, all this kind of stuff, and kind of fight against these odds to create that. Um, and I was really heavily into environmental filmmaking at that time. That's what I was kind of doing all my documentary work in grad school on, was nature docs. And so I started looking up like, are there any Kurdish artists who do like landscape portraiture and landscapes and that kind of stuff? And then there's also this element of the story where Kurdish people have this famous saying that is "no friends but the mountains," because they're these kind of perennially oppressed ethnic group, and they credit a lot of their persistent success in surviving to their knowledge of mountains, and they can
Mm.
always retreat to the mountains and regroup and
And the
plan
mountains
from
are constant.
the
And
mountains are
yeah.
always there. They'll never leave them. And so I was like, okay, that might be an interesting connection to Form 2. I said long story short, but this is really the long story. Basically, I was looking for Kurdish artists to
Yeah.
profile. And that's how I found Taha. Taha is a landscape painter, and he is an author, and he's a mathematician.
Hmm.
And I was like, those three things are interesting.
Yeah.
He's multi-talented, and he's got interesting paintings. Actually, this is a
Ah, yeah.
Taha
Yeah.
original right now, right here, and I was reading this blog post. I found him through this blog post on a website called the Kurdish Project. And it's Taha talking about his life, how he escaped from Iraq in his middle age, and he escaped with his four sons and his wife, and survived for a
Which,
time
and that was
period.
in like the 80s, right?
1991 thereabout.
91. Okay. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And so this was kind of around the time of the Gulf War, and that was
Yeah.
really the last straw for him to escape Iraq, is that he had become aware that he might be drafted by Saddam Hussein into the Gulf War. And the context there is that Saddam Hussein uh, is of like the Arab ethnicity, and the Kurdish ethnicity at the time was totally oppressed with like very few civil liberties. They were like not allowed to take on certain jobs. They were not allowed to go to graduate school, all sorts of stuff. And Taha was under the impression at the time that he and a couple of his sons were going to get drafted into the Gulf War by Saddam to basically be like human shields for the other fighters. Like they knew that the Kurdish fighters in Saddam's army were not going to be uh, like in very secure situations, right? That they were just going to be on the front lines. And so they left Iraq and paid a smuggler 45,000 USD at the time to take them to the Turkish border. They had to cross these checkpoints that were heavily guarded, and Taha has these intense stories about walking through minefields, trying to get around these checkpoints, and just not knowing, if the next step he was going to take, or that his wife was going to take, or their kids were going to take, were going to be their last. They were in Turkey for a time, kind of bopping around from internment camp to safe house to prisons at some points, finally regrouping and being able to eventually end up at this American military base, actually back in Iraq, right on the border in this city called Zako, um, where they worked as translators and kind of befriended some of the military personnel there, and eventually, kind of through the relationships they formed at this military base, um, were able to get asylum in the United States and come to Minnesota.
Yeah.
So yeah, um, that is a lot of backstory. The film is really about Taha's math pursuits,
Yeah.
and that's kind of where these ideas kind of come in. If we take this back to dominant forms of storytelling
Hmm.
versus kind of um, kind of fighting against those dominant forms of storytelling. Taha to me is this very kind of outsider character.
Yeah.
He has a master's degree in math, and I don't know if I mentioned, but he claims to have solved five of the world's hardest math problems, which is by any stretch in the math world a pretty outlandish
Pretty big
claim in some
claim. Yeah.
ways. Pretty big claim. Um, and he's an incredibly intelligent guy. Like he is he's almost 80 years old, but he's very with it. He's very intelligent and ambitious. He's very ambitious, and believes that he's solved these famous math problems. And so the film is really looking at it's kind of using that goal of his to kind of interrogate how he's actually really using math as this almost kind of therapy to overcome some of these traumas in his early life living under Saddam Hussein in Iraq. And he talks about it in the film. It's currently with the editor right now, and I'm kind of working to build this story of how, diving into it, like this passionate pursuit,
Yeah.
is his way of kind of confronting some of these things that
Yeah.
still haunt him. Yeah.
It's so fascinating. I was fortunate enough to be on not all but several of the big interviews for the doc, and no spoilers or anything like that. But I think one of the things that I think I really took from it is what you were just talking about there, that like the creative pursuits, because the math is a creative pursuit for him.
Yeah.
Math gets a bad rap as a science. It's more of an art than a science, I think,
Absolutely.
sometimes.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, we all use art and creative pursuits as ways to heal or process or make understanding of things. And I mean, I can know I speak for myself in that. And him being 80 or almost 80 years old and still having that passion and that fire and that determination that he's right and he's going to win. Um, Whether or not you think that he is right, like you can't help but walk away from a conversation with him going, well, I'm ready to run through a brick wall. Like he's an inspirational guy. And yeah, there's so much I'd like to talk about, but I don't want to spoil anything from the doc, but I'm really excited to see how the final story comes together. Because I think it's one of those universal timeless stories of someone who's overcome a lot and who still isn't satisfied, who's still, you know, isn't just sitting around enjoying retirement, even though he very well could and deserves to. He's still fighting and striving to leave a legacy, and it's really cool.
He's very. I'm inspired by him, and then, that's a big thing is trying to manage the I'm inspired by him, but will audiences be? Like one of the questions I've had to answer as I've started telling people about this film, and I'm bringing on collaborators and trying to find funding, and just trying to bounce ideas off people. The question I keep coming up against is like, well, why are you making this movie about him if you don't think he's right about his claim? And I've really had to kind of workshop my own thinking about it. And this started as a film about a guy who claims to have solved one of the world's hardest math problems, and that ambition rubbing up against reality. And as I've continued to make it, number one, I've kind of understood, oh, this is more a film about trauma and how he's dealing with trauma. And number two, I've also had to like kind of reformulate how I'm explaining the film to people in terms of, this is not necessarily a film about this quixotic journey where this guy is on this path that leads nowhere.
Right.
It is about a family that is
Yeah.
trying to heal from a really difficult
Yeah.
past. And that's where I think that universality is going to come in with the story. So
Yeah, I have a question for you that's kind of a little bit more of like a nuts and bolts filmmaking question though, that
yeah,
just what you were saying brings up. I think this is a prime example of a story that could be taken in a lot of different ways. One filmmaker could make this story about how Taha's right and the world is wrong, and how American academia is shorting him, and all these different things. Another filmmaker could make it quixotic, and like Taha's not with it. Like he's a little loony on this thing. Like he thinks he's got something that he doesn't. But another filmmaker like yourself focus, no, it's not about the end result, it's about the journey, it's about the family, the trauma. How do you as a documentarian balance where you land in that while still being truthful? And and how do you know when to let your view shape, and when to try to be more objective?
it's a good question. And it's definitely something I've struggled with on this film because, like I started describing it to you in terms of my interest in Kurdish ethnic politics,
Yeah,
that's not what this film is about anymore at all,
right.
really.
It morphs, it
In some
grows.
ways, in some ways it is, and in some ways it isn't. But I think to answer your question, there are probably like two things. I think the first thing for me is trusting collaborators,
Mm,
and I uh, and this is a micro budgeted mini doc. It is really driven by myself
okay,
and a few other collaborators that I've hired, like yourself, and a few other like more kind of like consultancy friends who I'm bouncing ideas off of and that kind of
right.
stuff. And I've also, I at some point through the process, I just was like, I cannot be the editor of this project anymore. If you go through film school, you'll hear that writer directors should not be their editors on any project, and it's best to hand that off to fresh eyes. But I always kind of like had a little bit of tension with that idea in terms of being a little bit of a perfectionist and a obsessive control freak a little with my projects. But with this project in particular, I was like, this story is now too complex. Now this
Sure.
story is, you could make the story a math story, a refugee story, an
Yep.
art story. It could be all of these things, and how do
You could
I?
single out almost any one of his kids and make the story about them.
They're
Like
all
there's
fascinating.
so much stuff. Yeah.
They're this the family, the members of this family all have like these amazing personal stories as well because they all went through this harrowing
Right.
journey earlier in their lives. But the editor of the project, her name is Myra, and she is a Lebanese refugee to the United States. And I reached out to her about maybe a couple months ago now, and was just like, I need a collaborator on this project who can bring in a totally different perspective to this than my suburban DV cam running around the woods, like white boy lifestyle that informs how I look at art, right? And that is kind of like one of the really big things in terms of kind of leaning on a collaborator to fill in some of those like perception gaps and to kind of help craft the story. And it's like, yeah, and it's exciting for me too. Like I'm like jazzed up about this, where I'm like, oh, this is going to make the project so much more interesting and
Yes.
in depth and amazing. And
On the other side of the fear of letting go of your project is the elation of it becoming something bigger and better than you ever thought it could be.
yeah,
I've experienced the exact same thing, and my last several projects I've handed off the editing, and I'm so glad I have for so many reasons. A, they've just been better. B, it's so exhausting to do all the work and all the filming and then sit down with all the footage. Like, it just there's a reality of, like, especially with larger projects or even short docs that have a lot of footage, exhaustion sets in. Mental, creative exhaustion sets in, and if you can't manage that within yourself, like, you're gonna burn out on the project, and it's either not gonna get done or it's not gonna get done as well as it should. So there's practical, like, physiological reasons to hand off the editing, as well as just diverse perspectives, and, someone may just straight up be a better editor than you and I are, sort of thing.
yeah, that she's a professional, and
Right,
I'm
exactly.
jack of all trades, right? And so there's a time when the jack of all trades needs to hand it off to a professional for sure. But yeah, absolutely. I felt like I was just drowning in the complexity of this story. I felt like I had lost all perspective on what story beats were going to be most meaningful and significant, and what was going to be an upbeat and what was going to be a downbeat, and what the sequencing should all look like. I was just totally drowning in this film, and it's going to be a short. Like it's going to be 25 minutes long. Like, and I was just like, oh, I can't do this.
Right.
I think it's bringing on collaborators and just doing a lot of pre-production and doing a lot of research and I've read quite a bit about math at this point. I've read quite a lot about Kurdish history and politics, and um, I think just like a really like integrated like research process goes a long way in kind of like helping you identify what those like important things to ask are going to be and important story beats are for sure.
Yeah. What is something that in the journey of this project that you've learned about filmmaking that has really surprised you? Because I would guess that this is one of the larger, if not the largest, like, personal project you've undertaken. Um, so just, as you continue to grow and step into bigger and bigger projects, right? Closer and closer towards that goal of doing features or whatnot. Like, what's something you've learned that you're really taking away so far from this?
With this project, I'm really kind of forcing myself to integrate a rigorous approach to documentary ethics into film that I wasn't quite as knowledgeable about beforehand, or in some ways maybe mature enough to like act to integrate into the filmmaking process. And I guess what I'm trying to say is I'm making a film about a main character who believes he's done something and I don't believe he has. And that poses huge. I mean, if you go to documentary school specifically, if you do an undergrad in documentary studies or a grad in documentary production, or you just take a documentary class in college, it is functionally an ethics course. 90% of what you're going to talk about in a documentary class in academia is ethics, because you are very vampiric as a documentary filmmaker all the time.
Yep.
You are asking somebody to open up their life to you
You are
to
changing, you are stepping on the butterfly. You are changing the tenor of the room. You are changing the way people show up. The camera's presence is a whole thing. It's a, it's a huge responsibility when you show up to do a doc.
100%, because you can edit. You can, somebody can say something to you and you can rearrange their words
Yep.
if you want. you
Yep.
you are you are God when you are behind the editing chair, I guess you could say.
And therefore you can
And
very quickly become a villain.
yeah, absolutely. And in that position, you hold a lot of responsibility, and it is imperative to be very upfront, I think, with your documentary subjects. I do not make documentaries in the vein of like Michael Moore. I am not looking to ambush anybody or put anybody on the spot. I am all about informed consent in documentary filmmaking and telling people how I plan on framing them in the end product. The film in Taha's Theorem, there's a source, so there's a character who's a math professor who's really kind of lending uh, credibility to the film in a lot of ways with his presence in the movie. And there's a scene in the movie where he talks to Taha about Taha's proof, and they have functionally a disagreement about the validity of it. To have that conversation, to have both of these men agree to talk to each other to have this conversation recorded for the film, I basically told the math professor, I'm asking you to do this, but I need you to trust me that you are not going to be the villain of this movie.
Right.
You are not going to be presented in a way that is going to make you look like this evil academic.
Taha has this dream, and here you come to crush it. Yeah.
Right. You are the expert source. You are not the villain, you are the expert, is
Right.
kind of how I put it to him. And that's how I'm gonna make the film.
Yeah.
That is what is going to be presented to the audience. And the flip side of that has been being very clear with Taha that this is not a film about how right he is.
Mm,
And this is not a film. I've told him so many times now, I am not a mathematician, and I
yeah.
cannot personally verify how right or wrong you are. And therefore, this film is going to be about how interesting I think you are, not
Right.
about how I think you are.
Right.
And that has been, that has had to be a conversation in this movie in terms of, what the end product is going to be. Um, and for me, it's kind of like a non-confrontational person, like for me, is like kind of on the maybe sometimes more introverted end of the spectrum, somebody who's kind of shied away from controversy sometimes,
Yeah.
and definitely don't like picking fights with anybody. But kind of having to posit something that made me afraid
Mm,
that this could make Taha walk,
yeah.
like and that was tough, but as a documentarian, you have to do that. You have to be prepared for people to walk from your
Yeah.
film if you cannot come to an agreement with fully informed consent on both sides.
Right.
And that's my little documentary ethics spiel.
Yeah.
I've been
And that's a fantastic lesson to learn and to implement. And no, I think that you've struck on an element of filmmaking that you don't see the YouTube bros talking about very often, right? Doesn't matter what camera you've got, it matters how truthful you are and how much character you have. And filmmaking in general, I think, has the gotcha journalism, the gotcha documentation or documentary style is unfortunately, I think, what some people think this is. And it's like, no, this isn't a what we're doing is we're attempting to show truth. Um, but truth is so complex that and we're all such subjective beings that we're, in some respects, we've all got very, very dim flashlights as we're stumbling around in the dark, and we're trying our very best to not bump into each other and not knock something over. And sometimes things do get knocked over, but in the end, if we can help someone get to the door a little bit, there's my big analogy, then that's the goal. So that I thank you for sharing that. That's pretty awesome.
I know I called documentary filmmaking like vampiric when I started out saying this, but I think there is legitimately, like, there can absolutely be a symbiotic relationship
Yes,
between
100%.
filmer and filmed, and documentary should be a thing that lifts people up and
Yeah.
tells other people
I
stories.
think it's
And
good to remember that without proper intention and coming to it with the right ethics, you will end up being vampiric. Like that is what you will default into, whether you mean to or not, if you don't take the proper steps to do it ethically. Um, and that's where it's like, yeah, you're going to fail, you're going to mess up sometimes, you're going to maybe make a project. I've got examples of projects I've directed that I'm like, oh, that was manipulative what I said or did in that moment. And you know what? I haven't done it since. Right? And like that's the biggest thing is like learn from it, grow, get better, make your next project and your next experience better than the last one.
Yeah, man, this all comes from the failure of my thesis film.
Yeah.
I spent huge amounts of time and money with vastly more professional film gear to do a huge swing project for my thesis film in grad school that will never see the light of day because I messed up some core relationships between the interviewer and the interviewee, and
Yep.
uh, did not fully represent what the end product was going to be and how it was going to frame certain people in my thesis film. And I'm ready to bury a film I spent years making
Yeah.
right now, that only I will ever see,
Yeah.
basically. My thesis advisor, basically. So in a lot of ways, Taha's theorem is I'm absolutely using a lot of skills I learned from failure
Yep.
to make sure that this treats everybody fairly, and still like, you don't want to make this is not a promo for Taha.
Right.
That's never the goal with these. You don't need to acquiesce to everything that a source or an interviewee or a character in your film wants the film to be,
Right.
but you do have to be honest with them.
Right. But you couldn't have told Taha's story the way you are if you hadn't failed at your thesis film. And
Yep.
that's
Yep.
just life.
Yeah.
Like we either let it knock us down and keep us down, or we get back up, we dust ourselves off, we try again, we do better next time. And I can take firsthand from seeing you work and from seeing some of the footage that I think you're knocking it out of the park. So I'm excited to see where it goes.
Hell yeah, man. I mean, always be making something. And, it can be tough when you got a day job. But like you said, I am working on stuff right now, and I'm hoping to come out with a new film in the next year.
Yeah.
And, it's hopefully going to be one of many in my 30s, I
There you
guess.
go. Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's a
Yeah.
new era for Aaron.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Yeah, thanks for having me on, man.